Historians have often spoken of an age of revolution when they refer to the late 18th and 19th century. It was certainly a period of dramatic political events, one that saw governments toppled and people engaging in new forms of political activism. But what does this term Age of Revolution really signify? Broadly speaking, this so-called Age of Revolution signaled a shift in politics, a shift from dynastic kingdoms to a new conception of territory and authority, or nations ruled by the people. The revolutions that broke out signaled a revolt against the power of kings, but they also saw revolts against colonial power as well, marking a broad movement against established authority and what were perceived to be unjust regimes. Ultimately, the revolutionary upheavals of the late 18th century would produce a new conception of sovereignty. Whereas kings had once been considered the legitimate rulers of their kingdoms, in the wake of these revolutions, the people, or the nation, became conceptualized as new legitimate authorities. However, these movements did not occur in a vacuum. In order to understand them, in order to understand what motivated them, we have to look at European society prior to the late 18th century. During the 16th and 17th centuries, European kings had carried out numerous reforms in government that would create the architecture of what we might think of today as the modern state. During the Middle Ages, the power of kings had been quite limited by all standards. Typically, the nobility had as much power, or sometimes even more power, than the king in their respective regions. The nobility controlled the local economy, they dictated the laws in their jurisdictions, they were the backbone of the military. In fact, kings were customarily required to consult with nobles through representative bodies known as estates, or, as the English called it, parliament. These estates guaranteed that the nobility could exercise control over the king and effectively limit his power. The church as well was independent from royal power. It took its orders from the Pope in Rome, not the monarch. It had its own legal systems, and it was typically one of the largest property owners in the kingdom. The church even levied its own taxes on the people. In addition to the church, cities usually had their own representative bodies and councils that operated independently of the king as well. Wealthy merchants often used these councils to promote their own interests and policies. They controlled trade and taxes without having to consult with the king. So, in short, kings did not hold a great deal of authority. They continually had to bargain with these representative bodies in order to rule. This, however, began to change in the 17th century. Absolutism marked a broad effort by European kings to concentrate their power and authority over these various corporate bodies. Monarchs from Spain to Prussia began assuming control over taxation and law. They created government offices to ensure that taxes were going into the royal coffers rather than supporting the nobility. Public officials responsible to the monarch were made judges in the provinces to ensure the king's law was being enforced. Kings now claimed to be the sole public authority. They had the right to enforce the law, to control taxation, and to direct the military. New state bureaucracies were created to ensure that this was the case. In its broadest sense, absolutism sought to get rid of the checks that had traditionally been placed on royal authority. It aimed to give the power of lawmaking and revenue collection solely to the crown, creating centralized states that could wield power more effectively. In some cases, these reforms even extended beyond continental Europe. This was because the predominant European powers were not just European kingdoms. They were expansive global empires that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the European continent to the periphery of Asia. Much like continental Europe, the overseas territories were characterized by a great deal of legal and political diversity. Since the 15th century, merchant firms and charter companies had played a key role in Europe's imperial expansion. These companies funded explorations, they transported settlers, and underwrote the mining operations and plantation agriculture that made imperialism lucrative. It was ultimately profit, or at least the expectation of profit, that drove them. In fact, some of these merchant firms even had their own militaries. Up until the mid-19th century, the British East India Company would govern India and provide the naval and military forces needed to secure British power on the subcontinent. Oftentimes, colonial and Creole elites occupied influential positions connected with government and the imperial economy. This was especially true in the British and Spanish colonies of the New World. In Spanish America, for example, the local consulados were virtually an entrenched oligarchy. They enforced the law, they oversaw the local chamber of commerce, they set prices on goods and taxation, and influenced positions at all levels of the colonial administration. In short, colonies had a great deal of autonomy. Rarely did they think of consulting with royal officials 3,000 miles away. And yet, as European kings began subscribing to absolutist ideas, the relationship between the metropole, or the mother country, and the colonies was due to change. Just as in Europe, royal government began to extend its reach over the colonies, clamping down on trade and subordinating colonies to royal authority. Beginning in the 1760s, the Spanish king, Carlos III, implemented a series of reforms designed to tap into the revenue of the New World. These reforms intended to deprive the consulados of their old privileges. Most importantly, they aimed to ensure that the money from the colonies was indeed flowing back to Madrid, rather than lining the pockets of colonial officials. Royal officials were appointed to supervise all trade. Governors clamped down on the local oligarchies and any intermediary bodies that might dilute central royal authority. Broadly speaking, absolutism created a more robust royal authority on the continent, just as much as it refashioned imperial bureaucracies abroad. Where power had once been diffuse and decentralized, royal governments were now bent on exerting their authority and centralizing power in their hands. Naturally, old elites protested this encroachment, but monarchies were reluctant to listen. By the 18th century, it was evident that a period of change was occurring, as experiments in government and royal authority upset older arrangements. One thing, however, that was slower to change was the social organization of European societies. Kings may have been eager to enact reforms in the domain of government and the economy, but they were less inclined to encourage changes in the traditional social hierarchies. To do so might bring into question the base of a society built upon royal privileges and obedience to established authority. European societies were sharply stratified. Nobles, or aristocrats, retained privileged positions. They were exempt from most forms of taxation. They had their own legal codes, distinct from the common people. They even sat in assemblies and government bodies as a separate order, that ensured aristocratic interests were represented and defended. They were, in short, a social group unto themselves, and traditionally the only means of entering this group was through birth. The clergy as well was treated as a separate group with its own laws and its own privileges. The church abided by canon law, which was codified in Rome. Church properties were tax-exempt, and in many cases, outside the jurisdiction of the crown. In return for these privileges, religious authorities were committed to supporting the crown. They provided theological and religious justifications for royal rule and authority, insisting that monarchies ruled through divine right ordained by God alone. In this way, an alliance between throne and altar was effectively sealed. Ethnic and foreign groups residing in countries also had their own arrangements with the royal government. They were subject to special laws, and they too had certain privileges guaranteed by the crown. The Jews were one of the most obvious groups. They were subject to traditional rabbinical laws in some kingdoms. They had their own community leaders who attended to religious and social affairs within the Jewish community. What we can see from these examples is that there was no idea of a common legal code or equality under the law. Different groups abided by different laws and had different arrangements. European societies were, in this respect, corporatist societies. They were composed of various corporate groups, like the nobility and the clergy, that had rights and privileges unique to them. Inequality was also evident in the colonial world, and was even more explicit in many cases. In carving out their colonial empires, Europeans had conquered various native populations in the process, either pushing them off the land or enslaving them. The Atlantic plantations were dependent upon slave labor, much of it obtained through the African slave trade. Slaves had no rights. They were considered property, not individuals, and the law treated them as such. This was the most extreme form of inequality, but others also existed. Local colonial assemblies typically had their own laws that differed from those in the mother country. Moreover, colonial populations were highly diverse. Colonies possessed European settlers and Creoles born in the colony. There were also native groups, typically referred to as Indians, and people of mixed Afro-European descent. Each of these groups had particular legal systems and rights that were attached to them. There was no concept of a single law or equal rights. This idea was simply alien to most Europeans. And yet, as absolutist regimes enacted changes focused on government and state restructuring, it was evident that certain people began considering what these changes entailed for society as a whole. These questions, by and large, began to come from outside in most cases. During the period, a new type of intellectual and political culture was emerging in Europe, one that has broadly been categorized as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a pan-European project in many ways. It consisted of various philosophers, political thinkers, reformers, and writers with different opinions. But in spite of this diversity, there did remain some common threads linking various movements and ideas together. Enlightened thinkers emphasized that man was rational. In possessing reason, they argued, man could understand and shape the world that he lived in. They rejected the old standard sources of authority, namely classical knowledge in the Bible. Instead, enlightened thinkers put their faith in the empirical sciences, in secular ideas of natural law that stood outside the domain of religion and notions of divine providence. In all these claims, the Enlightenment would propose a new way of viewing the individual in society, and this inevitably translated into new political ideas as well. And among these new thinkers, there were two principal ones who collectively proposed what would become the basis of the liberal democratic state. In his assessment of what made a government legitimate, the English political theorist John Locke argued that good and just government was based upon a social contract. In a society, Locke believed, the individual willingly surrendered a portion of their rights and freedoms to ensure that the rights of all society were protected against tyranny and injustice. Naturally, Locke's theories reflected the constitutionalism of England, and they played an important role in the establishment of constitutional monarchy in the country during the late 17th century. According to Locke, the most fundamental rights were life, liberty, and the right to own property, or estate. Legitimate government based on the social contract was required to ensure that these rights were guaranteed to all members of society. For Locke, therefore, people came together within a civil society in order to resolve conflicts and promote the common good of all. To ensure that the state did not acquire too much power and violate the rights of the individual, Locke claimed that political power had to be separated, with various branches of the government serving as a series of checks on one another. In this way, the social contract could be honored, and the liberties of people fully realized. Locke's ideas became very popular among thinkers during the 18th century. They proposed a new model of government unlike any that had existed on the European continent. Yet, Locke was hardly the only theorist to pose new forms of governments in accordance with the principles of liberty and reason. In France, the political theorist JeanJacques Rousseau published his views on the social contract, opening his treatise with his famous declaration, "Man is born free, but everywhere he exists in chains." For Rousseau, government was not necessarily a question of preserving the liberties of the individual, as it was for Locke. In fact, Rousseau found Locke's theories on individual liberties lacking. What was to prevent individuals from dominating others in a society for their own personal gain or interests, Rousseau wondered. More to the point, government was a constraint on the people. And unless it was the people who held power in the government, they would continue to exist in chains, as Rousseau put it. It was, therefore, essential to ensure not only liberty, but equality as well. And in order to do this, political authority had to be subordinated to what Rousseau called the general will. The general will was an expression of what was good and beneficial for society as a whole, or more pointedly, an expression of the interests and desires of society, not just the individual. In order to realize the general will, people had to be able to freely participate and make their own society, Rousseau believed. This entailed that sovereignty in any society derived directly and explicitly from the people. Locke had never specified what type of political organization was best for society. As long as a government abided by the social contract, it was considered just. On the contrary, Rousseau did not hide his preference when it came to government. According to him, only a republic, a government in which the people ruled as equal citizens, could arrive at realizing the general will and working toward the good of all. Rousseau's republicanism was a far cry from the absolutism of European monarchs. It affirmed not only that a government should have the consent of the people, but that it should be the people's government. In the larger picture, the Enlightenment proposed a new set of political values and principles that ran counter to the tenets of absolutist monarchy. Intellectuals and elites were beginning to talk about what liberty meant, whether people did in fact have natural rights that should be protected, and what, in essence, constituted legitimate authority. These were sweeping questions, and they resounded through both European and colonial societies. If political philosophers claimed that men were naturally free, colonial elites were eager to defend their own supposed liberties against royal encroachment. In attempting to check the arm of absolutist government, colonists found the ideas of the Enlightenment helpful. On the same note, writers in Europe employed these very same arguments to attack the privileges enjoyed by the nobility and the absolutist system that protected them. By the middle of the 18th century, Europe was undergoing a change that questioned the very foundations of social and political power, whether at home or within the empire. And it was within this context that the violent struggles of the late 18th century were going to occur.